I was addressing things as the supervisor. There will be no comments. There will be anything. It will be me addressing you guys, telling you what's going on in the township. CBA, that's our collective bargaining agreement. That's our union contract. So it comes with the seat. That's what people are not saying.
Once seen as an unstoppable political force in Dalton, Tiffany Henyard now faces growing betrayal from those who once supported her, including her own spouse. The financial wrongdoing and abuse of power she is accused of have sparked an expanding investigation, causing her once loyal inner circle to crumble. Her name is in the news, but not for the reason she had hoped. To fully understand her downfall, it's crucial to examine her rise to power, an ascent marked by ambition and a carefully crafted image of invulnerability. However, as the investigation into her shady dealings intensifies, the facade she built over the years is collapsing. The federal government is reportedly conducting an extensive probe into her affairs, with former allies now working with law enforcement to ensure justice is served. During her time in office, Tiffany surrounded herself with loyal supporters, many of whom had questionable backgrounds, creating a web of enablers and scapegoats. She assumed that if any illegal activity surfaced, her loyalists would take the fall for her. But as the investigation gained momentum, her network began to unravel. The most shocking betrayal came from her own partner, Kamal Woods, once seen as a staunch ally. His cooperation with investigators suggests his involvement in Tiffany's alleged schemes was more complex than initially believed. As the director of her cancer foundation, a key part of her public image, Kamal's role in her business operations made him a central figure in the probe. Authorities are investigating whether the foundation, purportedly set up to aid breast cancer patients, was a legitimate charity or merely a publicity stunt. Suspicion arose when it received a large donation, leading investigators to question its true purpose. As they delved into its financial records, they suspected the organization was a front for less altruistic activities. With her position in jeopardy and her support system crumbling, Tiffany found herself increasingly isolated. Reports suggest she misused public funds, including money meant for Dalton's residents, to finance personal trips under the guise of promoting her foundation. These taxpayer-funded trips, allegedly part of her attempt to further her personal agenda, raised red flags among investigators. The case took a significant turn when Kamal Wood's name appeared in subpoenas, signaling that authorities were expanding their probe beyond Tiffany to the financial dealings of her inner circle. Kamal had been receiving a paycheck from Tiffany's foundation and had recently secured a lucrative job in Thornton Township, earning a six-figure salary, an amount unattainable for most Dalton residents. His financial gains and their connection to Tiffany's activities are now focal points of the investigation. Meanwhile, Tiffany's financial empire, built on deceit and manipulation, is unraveling. Among her business ventures was a restaurant and a property management company, both of which raised serious concerns. One standout case from 2019 involved a tenant losing their home due to hazardous living conditions, including mold and leaking buildings, exemplifying Tiffany's disregard for the well-being of Dalton's residents. What is most shocking, however, is how quickly her closest allies are turning on her. The very people who once shielded her from scrutiny are now cooperating with authorities, providing key information that could seal her political downfall. The most devastating blow came from her own child's father, once seen as a trustworthy figure in her life, whose willingness to work with law enforcement may be the final nail in the coffin. As the investigation heats up, a damning portrait of Tiffany's corruption, abuse of power, and self-serving decisions is emerging. Her downfall serves as a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and the illusion of invulnerability. What began as a rapid rise to power is now a dramatic and dishonorable fall from grace. Her former supporters are deserting her, ensuring law enforcement has everything needed to hold her accountable. With each new revelation, her fate seems more predetermined as federal investigators close in and her inner circle unravels. The dissolution of her political empire appears imminent and the investigation is far from over. As more secrets come to light, it is no longer a question of whether she will be held accountable, but when. Tiffany's empire is crumbling, and the people who once stood by her are now ensuring that justice is served. The coming chapters of her story will serve as a stark reminder of how quickly power can slip away and how easily those who once supported you can turn against you in the blink of an eye. The FBI began investigating Tiffany Henyard's business dealings just 6 months after she took over as supervisor of Thornton Township, requesting all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling intense scrutiny of her financial activities. As the corruption probe deepened, more individuals came forward to expose her actions, something Tiffany should have anticipated given the controversy surrounding her administration from the start. Criticism mounted, particularly from members of her own dream team, a group she had personally selected to manage the township. However, what was supposed to be a unified force quickly became a nightmare for her as those she trusted most. Trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, along with village clerk Allison Key, turned into outspoken critics, refusing to ignore her unethical decisions. As tensions escalated, the trustees, originally chosen for their perceived loyalty, began working with the village board to take legal action against her, accusing Tiffany of serious conflicts of interest as evidence mounted that she was using her position for personal financial gain rather than serving the people of Dalton. This controversy erupted just 6 months into her term, exposing deep divisions within her administration and fueling growing opposition. Rather than addressing their concerns, Tiffany retaliated, accusing them of intentionally causing controversy and undermining her vision to make Dalton great. Portraying herself as the victim of a political witch hunt, she further distanced herself from former allies, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. However, as the federal investigation expanded, examining every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, maintaining the facade of legitimacy became increasingly difficult. What started as whispers of corruption turned into a flood of allegations as more people came forward to reveal the truth about her administration. The turning point came when Tiffany's most ardent supporters, realizing the legal risks of remaining associated with her, began publicly distancing themselves. Once seen as untouchable, she now watched her empire crumble before her eyes, with every attempt to silence critics backfiring and reinforcing the belief that she prioritized self-preservation over serving Dalton's residents. As legal battles intensified, her administration became synonymous with conflicts of interest, and a lawsuit filed by the trustees made it
damage, and then it leaked one into my kitchen, and the window sill leaked in my daughter's room.
Except they weren't. Enter activist David Lowry, who called Dalton directly. Suddenly, the house seemed livable. On September 3rd, became unfit for occupancy. On October 15th, Lowry's theory?
Her leadership was tainted by corruption. The deeper the investigation went, the more evident it became that Tiffany's rise to power was built on self-interest rather than public service. Her retaliatory tactics, refusal to accept responsibility, and self-serving decisions only accelerated her downfall. With former allies now cooperating with federal authorities and determined to hold her accountable, each new revelation pushed her political career further toward an inevitable collapse. The FBI began investigating Tiffany Henyard's business dealings just 6 months after she assumed her role as supervisor of Thornton Township. Federal authorities had already requested all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling intense scrutiny into her financial activities. As the corruption probe deepened, more individuals stepped forward to expose her actions, something Tiffany should have anticipated given the controversy that had surrounded her administration from the start. Criticism against her mounted, particularly from members of her own dream team, a group she had personally selected to help manage the township. What was intended to be a unified force quickly unraveled into a nightmare as those she trusted most. Trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, along with village clerk Allison Key, emerged as some of her most outspoken critics, refusing to ignore her unethical and questionable decisions. Tensions escalated, and the trustees, initially chosen for their perceived loyalty, began working with the village board to take legal action against her. They accused Tiffany of serious conflicts of interest, particularly as growing evidence suggested she was leveraging her position to advance her personal financial interests rather than serving the residents of Dalton. This controversy erupted just 6 months into her term, exposing deep divisions within her administration and fueling growing opposition. Instead of addressing their concerns or taking responsibility, Tiffany retaliated in an attempt to regain control. She accused her critics of intentionally stirring controversy and undermining her vision to make Dalton great. By portraying herself as a victim of a political witch hunt, she further alienated herself from former allies. Refusing to admit any wrongdoing, her aggressive response only widened the divide between her and the very individuals who had once stood by her side. However, as the federal investigation expanded to include every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, it became increasingly difficult for Tiffany to maintain the facade of legitimacy she had so carefully constructed. What had initially been whispers of corruption quickly evolved into a storm of allegations, with more people coming forward to reveal the truth about her administration. The turning point arrived when even her most ardent supporters, realizing the potential legal ramifications of staying associated with her, began publicly distancing themselves. Once perceived as untouchable, Tiffany now watched as her political empire crumbled before her eyes. Every attempt to silence critics backfired, further solidifying the perception that she was more concerned with protecting herself than with serving the people of Dalton. As the legal battles intensified, Tiffany's administration became increasingly associated with conflicts of interest. A lawsuit filed by the trustees against her made it clear that her leadership had been tainted by corruption. The deeper the investigation went, the more evident it became that Tiffany's political rise had been built on a foundation of self-interest with little regard for the town or its residents. What had begun as an unstoppable ascent to power was now spiraling into a steady and inevitable downfall, driven by her own actions and the unwillingness of those around her to continue supporting her. Her attempts to retaliate against those who opposed her, coupled with her self-serving decisions and refusal to accept responsibility, only accelerated her collapse. The investigation continued to uncover more unethical practices, and former allies, now cooperating with federal authorities, were determined to hold her accountable. With each new revelation, Tiffany's political career seemed closer to its inevitable end. Many questioned whether the scrutiny she faced was excessive, but the reality was undeniable. Tiffany's leadership had failed Dalton in nearly every way. During her tenure, the town faced critical issues such as crumbling roads, abandoned homes, and a police force desperate for resources. Yet she continued to squander public funds on unnecessary expenditures rather than addressing these pressing problems. Even before she became mayor, her tactics had already taken on an authoritarian nature. She began excluding trustees from their offices, attempting to intimidate those who might challenge her authority. Dalton had once been a town that valued community cohesion and governance in the best interest of its residents, but under Tiffany's leadership, those values were being systematically undermined by her increasingly self-serving actions. Perhaps one of the most egregious examples of her disregard for the public was her lavish spending, which included using taxpayer dollars for extravagant billboards featuring her own face. Additionally, she used public funds for first-class flights and luxurious accommodations at upscale hotels, expenses that seemed to serve her personal agenda rather than the needs of the community she was supposed to represent. As federal investigators closed in, it became increasingly clear that Tiffany's political rise had been built on a series of corrupt practices and that her fall from power was not just inevitable, it was already underway. Her refusal to take responsibility, combined with her increasingly desperate attempts to cling to power, only made it more difficult for her to evade the consequences of her actions. Those who had once stood by her side were now actively contributing to the investigation that would ultimately dismantle her political empire. In the end, Tiffany Henyard's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the inevitable downfall of those who believe they are beyond accountability. Her once unshakable reign had been shattered, and the truth behind her corruption was finally coming to light. With federal authorities closing in and former allies working against her, it was clear that her political career was coming to a swift and undeniable conclusion. Tiffany's tenure as a political leader quickly descended into scandal, as her self-serving actions overshadowed her once promising career. Her extravagant lifestyle, manipulative tactics, and disregard for the welfare of Dalton's residents became increasingly evident, fueling the growing opposition against her leadership. One of the clearest indicators of her misplaced priorities was her habitual misuse of taxpayer dollars for personal gain, a recurring theme that would come to define her leadership style. Throughout her time in office, Tiffany spared no expense in crafting a larger-than-life image for herself. She employed high-profile DJs, professional photographers, and even hired a full security team to ensure her personal safety. These expenditures made it clear that Tiffany was more invested in bolstering her personal status than in fulfilling her duties as a public servant. Her leadership became more about self-promotion than about addressing the needs of the people who had elected her. Her fixation on self-promotion was so extreme that she went to great lengths to ensure that anything not directly benefiting her image was either canceled or sabotaged. One of the most striking instances of this occurred when she blocked the use of a public park for a local event. The gathering, organized by local resident Bosley, had been an annual tradition, but Tiffany scheduled her own competing event just a few miles away. Rather than allowing the community event to proceed as planned, she ordered massive cement blocks to be placed at the park entrance, effectively preventing the gathering from taking place. This was a clear display of her willingness to undermine anything that did not directly serve her self-interest. Her tactics became even more egregious when she deliberately disrupted other community events, further illustrating her egocentric leadership. Tiffany had promised Dalton improvement and progress during her campaign, but as time passed, it became apparent that her true priorities lay in maintaining her personal image and power. Trustees within the township realized that Tiffany's leadership was becoming a liability to the community. Her actions were no longer focused on addressing Dalton's pressing issues, such as infrastructure decay and underfunded services, but on preserving her own status. Recognizing the damage she was causing, they sought ways to curb her influence and ultimately remove her from office. One of the most infamous examples of Tiffany's self-serving behavior occurred when she shut down the annual car show in the parking lot of Neop Park, a beloved community event. Bosley, the event organizer, had paid $1,000 to the park district for the necessary permit and had made all the arrangements. However, on the day of the event, he arrived at the park to find concrete barricades blocking the entrance, with Dalton police officers threatening to tow any vehicles that attempted to park there. It became clear that Tiffany was determined to prevent any event from overshadowing her own self-promotional spectacle. This was just one of many instances in which she used her political power to manipulate situations for her own benefit, further proving that her leadership was driven by personal gain rather than genuine public service.